Hello, everyone, and welcome to Health Reform Beyond the Basics. Thank you for joining us for our fall series for coverage year 2024. Today's webinar is Boosting Enrollment Among People Who Are Immigrants and Their Families, Outreach and Application Process Considerations. I'm Aisat Odiale, the Health Projects Assistant at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and I'll be moderating today's webinar, which we are presenting in partnership with the National Immigration Law Program. Beyond the Basics is a project of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. It's designed to provide training and resources to facilitate enrollment in the ACA health insurance marketplaces and Medicaid. The Center on Budget and Policy Priorities is a nonprofit policy organization. We are not a part of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Beyond the Basics is aimed at healthcare assisters, advocates, state and local officials, and others who help people get and keep their health coverage. This webinar is not intended for press purposes, and while we do hope you will learn a lot, we are not able to offer continuing education credit for our webinars at this time. Second. Automated captions have been enabled for the webinar. To view them, you can click on the More option with 3 dots at the bottom of your screen, or you may see 2 C's icon. There you have the option to turn on closed captioning. All participants are muted and in listen-only mode, but if you'd like to ask a question, you can click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your webinar screen and type your question into the box. We will be monitoring questions throughout the presentation, and we will pause for Q&A at the end. We may not be able to answer every question being asked, but we will have a record of all of your questions, and we will use them as a guide for future resources and presentations. And you can also email your questions during and after the webinar to beyondthebasics@cbpp.org. A quick reminder that you won't be able to click on the screen to go to any links shared in the deck, but I will put a link to the slide deck in the chat for today's presentation. And after today's webinar, we'll email a recording of the presentation along with links to the slides and other resources. And we'll also be posting everything to the Beyond the Basics website. Here you can see the schedule of webinars in our fall series. The last 2 webinars in our fall series this year are Tying It All Together next Tuesday, and our webinar in Spanish next Thursday that focuses on enrollment issues most relevant for people who are immigrants and people who live in mixed immigration status households. We are excited to be celebrating 10 years of marketplace coverage as a part of our series this year. And so to celebrate, at each webinar, we'll be spotlighting veteran assisters from around the world. Today, we'll be highlighting Araceli Robledo. Araceli is a certified marketplace senior navigator for Primary Care Access Network in Florida. She's been in the role for 8 years. To Araceli, being an effective navigator represents commitment and responsibility, not only with the project, but also with people and families she assists. Showing empathy and providing genuine trust helps me connect in a very special way with them. One of the lessons she's learned over the span of her years as a navigator is it's more than a job, it's a mission. That the people who contact me or require my services feel valued and confident to receive the attention they deserve, connecting them with coverage or access to healthcare. That makes them want to return or refer other people. Here's what Ann Packham, who nominated Araceli, had to say about her being an effective assister. Araceli is genuinely interested in seeing that her consumers obtain the best outcome possible. She has been a tireless advocate for immigrants who receive a lot of confusing and erroneous information from others in the community. She's a fantastic spokesperson for navigators, always willing to do a radio show or post something on social media. Everyone loves working with Araceli. Thank you, Araceli, for your dedication, your empathy, and unwavering commitment to your work. We hope you enjoy your Beyond the Basics Tumblr. Today's webinar will cover public charge and navigating the application process. Today's presenters are Shelby Gonzales, Vice President of Immigration Policy at CBPP, and Gabrielle Lessard, Senior Policy Attorney from the National Immigration Law Center. Gabrielle specializes in the laws and policies affecting access to healthcare for low-income immigrants and their family. So with that, I will turn it over to you all to start.
Hello, everyone. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about public charge. Public charge is something that was an issue of great concern during the previous administration, which had adopted some regulations that greatly changed the policy. Those regulations have been rescinded, but there's still a lot of concern. So it's important to be conversant with this issue so that you can respond to people's concerns. So under immigration law, many people, and this primarily affects family-based immigrants, undergo a public charge assessment when they apply to become lawful permanent residents or when they seek permission to come to the United States. And that is on both an immigrant and a non-immigrant visa. Immigration officials are actually looking into the future to try to determine if the person in front of them is likely to become primarily dependent on the government for subsistence. And that standard is demonstrated by the use of two categories of public benefits. They are public cash assistance for income maintenance. That is a cash grant that's ongoing, that is intended to pay for a person's basic living expenses. The second is long-term institutional care paid by the government. So that's a kind of residential care, like living in a nursing home or being a long-term resident of a mental health institution. These are the only kind of benefits that can be considered in the public charge assessment. There's no other benefit that is negatively factored in, and that includes ACA marketplace subsidies and CHIP and Medicaid that are not used for long-term care in an institution. A question that came up frequently in past years was whether sliding scale fees at community health centers could be considered, and those are also not considered. Next slide, please. Okay, so in looking at the benefits that are considered, long-term care does not include short-term rehabilitation. So, for example, if you were in an acute care facility and had to go to a step-down facility, skilled nursing facility, that is short-term rehabilitation and is not considered long-term care for public charge purposes. Imprisonment for conviction of a crime is not considered. Also, neither are home and community-based services, even though they are an alternative to residential care. Receipt of benefits only counts when the person who's seeking the immigration status is the named beneficiary of the benefits. This is actually a significant departure from the previous interpretation of the rule, where if you had a child-only cash grant, that could be considered as a form of support for the whole family. Under the current regulations, only that named beneficiary can be considered. Also, very important to understand that many categories of immigrants are exempt from public charge. In general, these are people who are either permitted to come to the country or remain in the country for humanitarian reasons. There are a variety of them. They are detailed in the regulations, and they include people granted asylum, refugees, people who are applying for or who have received visas, U visas for victims of certain crimes, or T visas for victims of human trafficking, people who are self-petitioning under the Violence Against Women Act, that is not only available to women, and then people who are seeking or granted special immigrant juvenile status, which is available to children and youth who have had to seek the protection of the courts because of abuse or abandonment. Also important to know that a benefit a person received while they were in an exempt status are not considered in the public charge test. So if you received refugee benefits, for example, that included cash assistance, because there's refugee cash assistance. If you later went to apply to become a permanent resident, that would not be considered in your public charge assessment. One other thing I'm going to mention is that the public charge assessment looks at all facts and circumstances. So in addition to the use of benefits, they'll consider things like the person's educational level and work history and other factors that indicate they will be or not be dependent on the government. Next slide. So as I mentioned at the onset, people who are immigrants as well as their family members have really faced a lot of fear and confusion related to public charge. I mean, ultimately, this is a family separation issue. It comes down to whether you can remain here permanently. And many people have unfortunately opted not to apply for health coverage and other kinds of economic supports, including benefits that are never going to be considered in a public charge assessment. Enrollment assisters can play an important role in raising awareness that participation in health insurance affordability programs, with the exception of long-term care, is not negatively factored into public charge. You can share resources that detail current policies. We have some of them, actually a number of them linked below. Provide information about the value of comprehensive health insurance, as well as the privacy protections that ensure that people's information will only be used for determining their eligibility and will never be used for shared with immigration enforcement. Of the two links that we have below, and you'll be able to access these when you get the slide deck, has an interactive tool called keepyourbenefits.org that's available in Spanish and Chinese in addition to English. And that enables people to actually walk through their first personal situation and determine whether they would be subject to a public charge assessment. And then a number of public charge community resources, which are, I believe, available in 10 languages, including English, that are public facing and something that you can pass out and share. Next slide, please. So again, concerns related to privacy. Any information that a person provides in a health insurance application or an application for a healthcare affordability program like Medicaid is private and only can be used for the administration of that program. So people who worry that completing an application for health coverage will expose them to immigration enforcement, or even an application for coverage for someone else, can be reassured about the privacy of that information. First of all, under some long-standing guidance, people who are applying for coverage for someone else in their household, such as a child, don't need to provide information about their own immigration status. Even when they are applying, the privacy rules will protect them. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the laws that govern the ACA marketplaces, Medicaid, and CHIP limit the use of information collected to eligibility determination purposes. It's protected from unauthorized disclosure from other purposes. And in certain states, there are state laws that are even more restrictive than the federal rules cited here. And then, of course, people who receive that information in the course of their work, including assisters, are required to keep that information secure. And we have this resource available on our website with more information about tips for addressing privacy concerns. At this point, I will turn it back to Shelby.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through some processes that are often processes that could become confusing or could cause some concerns for people who are immigrants. Some of the slides that I'm going to go through are slides that I went through during, if you were part of the data matching issues webinar that we did last week, I think. So that particular webinar has more detail than what I will be providing today around data matching issues. So I really recommend that if this is an area that you want to dive in a little bit deeper into, that you go ahead and spend some time on that webinar as well, which is available on our website. So next slide, please. So first, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about eligibility verification and how it works within the marketplaces. So it's important to note that there are certain factors that are fine for people to just attest to, and that is sufficient for the application to serve as the verification. So oftentimes those factors that are eligibility oriented might be things like state residency or marketplace residency. Eligibility based off of citizenship and immigration status are not one of those factors. There needs to be some type of verification of the attestations that are made by the applicant. And the way that this is done is that the marketplaces are connected to what's called, oftentimes referred to as the federal hub. Sometimes we refer to it as the federal services hub. And basically, the applicant will put information into the application, and then the federal hub will take some of those data points that are relevant, and then they will share them with a trusted agency. So when we're thinking about citizenship and immigration status, for citizenship, the first step is that the Federal Data Services Hub will take information such as the Social Security number and the person's name and other information, and they will send it to the Social Security Administration, and then the Social Security Administration may or may not be able to substantiate the claim that the individual is a citizen. So that is basically what's done. On the immigration front, and as well as for certain citizens, information is shared with information that's held by the Department of Homeland Security. We often refer to it as the SAVE system. And that information, again, there's certain numbers that are the person will be first asked, are you a citizen? If they're not, then they'll be asked, do you have an eligible immigration status? And if so, then they're going to be able to provide some numbers. The numbers and some other factors like name and date of birth and other things are shared with the Department of Homeland Security. And then there will be an attempt to verify information electronically. That's how the application is intended to work. Next slide, please. So here we go through what that experience looks like on this for somebody who's a citizen. So let's say that I'm a citizen, and in the application I provide my Social Security number, and I attest to the question, which is Jane a U.S. citizen or a U.S. national? We'll pretend that it said Shelby instead of Jane, and I will say yes. And if I attest to U.S. citizenship, then healthcare.gov or your state-based marketplace will check that information, that attestation, with Social Security Administration first. And if the Social Security Administration can substantiate the claim of citizenship, perfect. We move on, right? But if it can't, then another question will be asked, whether or not I am a naturalized or derived citizen. And if I say yes, then I will be asked if I have one of these documents, either a naturalization certificate or a certificate of citizenship. Information then will be asked of me to provide that would be on those documents. And then that information is taken by healthcare.gov or your state-based marketplace, and it's through the federal hub, and it will be asked of the SAVE database that is held by the Department of Homeland Security. And if they can use that information to verify my citizenship, all is good, and I move on, right? Just to be perfectly clear and to make sure to kind of manage expectations, do not know a lot of people who have been naturalized, who have gone through the naturalization process, or who are derived citizens that kind of carry around these documents on their person every day. So what does that mean for you? And when somebody comes in to your office, it means that you might have they might not be ready to provide that information to you during that encounter. What it might mean to you is that if you are doing some type of pre-intake when you're making appointments for people to come in to help with the application process, you may ask them, hey, I don't, it would be hard because you oftentimes won't get to the point that you would know whether or not somebody was a naturalized or derived citizen. But if for whatever reason you do know that, that might be something to help, or maybe you send a document that says here's good things to bring with you to the appointment if you have them available. You want to thread that needle kind of carefully. You don't want to scare people and make them think that they have to provide everything, but at the same time, I know that when you have an individual with you in person, that's the best time to be able to go through the process. So just putting that out there so that you know that this is not something that a lot of times people who have gone through the naturalization process or who are derived citizens just carry these things around. They might be more likely to have their passport with them than they would have one of these documents. Next slide, please. So when an individual cannot be verified electronically, so we'll pretend that Jane or Shelby, whatever you like, was, that example that I just gave. Maybe I was a naturalized citizen and I don't have that document number with me, or, the relevant numbers provided into the system. I might get a DMI, which is a data matching issue. And when somebody gets a data matching issue, it's important for you to remember that it doesn't mean that they didn't tell the truth on the application. It just means that for whatever reason, the system was not able to verify their attestation in real time. And that's important just to remember, because there's plenty of reasons. There's just limitations in the data that all of these systems have, that people change their name. Sometimes there's error in, typing. There's a variety of reasons why this might not work. When that happens, the individual will have a data matching issue. There will be something that comes up on screen if you're on healthcare.gov that indicates you are eligible, but you need to provide some additional documentation. But you can go ahead and proceed and enroll in coverage, but you need to provide some additional documentation within X number of days, which is generally 95 days. For citizenship, what that looks like is you could provide a copy of your U.S. passport. Again, that certificate of citizenship that we mentioned in the earlier slide, the certificate of naturalization. In some cases, there are some states that you can even provide the state-issued enhanced driver's license, as pictured here, and the names of the states where that is available it's also there. And then there's some other documents, including some tribal enrollment cards. Any one of these documents on this page, it's fine to just submit that one document, and it will take care of meeting the verification need. But oftentimes people don't have these, right? There's a variety of reasons why they might not. And if that's the case, there are alternative documents you have to provide, which in the next slide, please, you'll see that if you don't have one of those on the previous slide, then you can submit at least two documents, one from the left side of this table and one from the right side. So on the left side, you have a variety of documents that are intended to prove that the person is a U.S. citizen. And on the right side, they're documents that are intended to prove identity. So together, those create a verification. So if you don't have one of the items on the first slide, which take care of both citizenship and identity, then you need to provide 2 documents. So it gets a little bit trickier. Next slide, please. For people who are not citizens, they again will be asked, "Are you a citizen?" You know, and you would say no. And if the person says no, then they will ask, "Do you have, eligible immigration status?" And then you'll see that a list of statuses will be provided through a link if you want to look at those statuses. And the individual then is supposed to see if, they see themselves on that list, then if they have one of those, then they can say, yes, I have an eligible immigration status. And if they do, then they will be asked, to select a document type. And then there's going to be some numbers that are associated with that document type that the individual will be asked to provide on their application. And then the marketplace will use those numbers as well as other information that was provided on the application. They will send it to the SAVE system and they will try and verify immigration status that way. Next slide, please. And we have a table here on this is the first page. We have a second page as well, where we just identify what the numbers that will be requested based off of the different document that the individual selects from the drop-down menu. So if the person says, I have a permanent resident card, then they will be asked to provide an A registration number and a card number. So then they would, look at their cards and then gather that information. Next slide, please. You'll see that we just have more documents here as additional examples. And I'm not going to read this to you. We actually have this here on the slides. We have it on the DMI slide. And then we also have a reference guide to documents used to verify immigration status. So it's kind of like a desktop aid that I actually would recommend just keeping handy, maybe on your desktop, maybe on, just because it's not going to be super intuitive. And it's just helpful to have as a reference. Next slide, please. So speaking of not super intuitive, it's also important to note that, how I mentioned and how we show you in those tables, before this slide, is that the application will ask for numbers, but the way those numbers are labeled on the different cards may or may not match. So that is tricky. That's very, very tricky. And that's one of the reasons why I also suggested using that reference document that I mentioned, and that's on the link on the prior slide. And that's on our website, because this is tricky. It's not, and again, especially if you don't help a lot of people who are immigrants, on a regular basis, it's going to be really easy to forget which one of these documents. Healthcare.gov also, just in case, you're having trouble looking for it or whatever, there's also, doing a search on healthcare.gov, and they take a few links that you'll navigate through, but they too will have some documents, examples of different documents, different iteration of documents, because these have changed over the years, and sometimes they're labeled one thing and sometimes they're labeled another thing. So I would not try to memorize all of these things. Rather, I would use those reference documents as a guide when you're helping somebody to identify the correct numbers from their cards. Next slide, please. So you want to do everything you can. And that's, again, one of those reasons why I keep on going back to using reference documents and doing your best to get the right numbers in. because you want to do everything you can to avoid a data matching issue, just for everybody, right? Because we all know that once you have a data matching issue, you really run a risk that you might lose coverage if you're not successful at overcoming the data matching issue. But in addition to that, for individuals who are immigrants, there might be another problem that comes up for them. And this is a situation that happens when an individual is eligible for premium tax credits because even though their income is either in the Medicaid range or below the federal poverty line, because they're eligible for enrollment in the marketplace, but they don't meet the more restrictive eligibility requirements based off of immigration status that would qualify them to enroll in Medicaid. So let me just say that again, because I think I said it a little bit in a very confusing way. In Medicaid, and if you've seen our other presentation that Gabrielle and I did on immigration eligibility, you might recall that we have this kind of diagram where we say the universe of people who are eligible for marketplace coverage and certain other kinds of Medicaid coverage. An individual must have an immigration status that's considered lawfully present or lawfully residing in some cases for Medicaid. But let's just talk about the marketplace for now. Lawfully present. That is a lot of different immigration statuses. It's most immigration statuses would make you eligible to purchase insurance in the marketplace. For Medicaid and CHIP, that is not the case. It's a very restrictive number of people who, different kinds of immigration statuses that you would have to qualify to enroll in Medicaid and CHIP. So very small universe of people. Plus, a lot of people for Medicaid and CHIP also have to meet a 5-year wait. So it's not even enough. Like if you have a lawful permanent resident status, which oftentimes is referred to as green card, not enough to have that. You also have to have had that for 5 years. So there's a lot of people who are left out of being eligible for Medicaid based off their immigration status. So when a person has the income that would qualify them for Medicaid, but they are not eligible for Medicaid because their immigration status, if they have a DMI, then the marketplace is going to be confused about what to do about their eligibility, right? Because the marketplace it's going to assume that the person, when they said, I have an eligible immigration status, they're going to assume that that person has an eligible immigration status for Medicaid. So we know that that is not the case for a lot of people who are applying for Medicaid. So if there's a DMI, then it becomes pretty complicated to get the right eligibility determination for individuals who have their income either in the Medicaid range or below the federal poverty line or, right? So what happens? If the person is otherwise looking like they're eligible for Medicaid based on income and all other factors, they will be sent to Medicaid, okay? That is a long pathway, right? Because they will be sent to Medicaid, then they're going to wait in line to get their application to be, processed. They'll probably be asked, can you provide, proof of your immigration status? Then eventually, maybe weeks and weeks and weeks, from that point, Medicaid will say you're ineligible based off of your immigration status. And then they may send them back to the marketplace, but people may not really understand once that happens because a lot of people are lost through that transition back to the marketplace. If a person it has income below 100% of the poverty line and otherwise does not look like they're eligible for Medicaid, so they appear to be like in the coverage gap, for example, say their state has not expanded Medicaid, then what they're going to experience is that they're going to be told that you can enroll in a marketplace plan, but you will not be told that those marketplace plans are discounted because you're eligible for a PTC or cost sharing reduction. They will be asked to provide proof of their immigration status, but as you can imagine, when you see this huge price tag and it's super unclear to you that you are indeed eligible for a discounted price, you just need to provide your immigration status, that there's very few people who then on their own without a lot of help are going to say, oh yeah, let me provide the immigration status and I'll, be able to pay for, a full cost plan on my own during this time. It will seem like it's really out of reach for a lot of people. So I just want to be clear about that because this is one of those cases where your assistance can make all of the difference in the world to get the right eligibility determination. So let's go to the next slide. And I'm going to kind of walk through what happens in the different scenarios. So first, let's imagine that a person appears to be eligible for Medicaid. So this is an individual that, maybe they're in a state that's likely that that's expanded Medicaid. The market, sometimes also this happens in states anyway, it can happen for a variety of reasons. But let's say that in this case, it's a state that expanded for Medicaid. So they look like they're eligible for Medicaid. There's a DMI. The marketplace assesses or determines that the applicant is eligible for Medicaid. The case is sent to the state Medicaid agency for further eligibility review, including verification of immigration status. The Medicaid agency notifies the applicant that proof is needed, including but not limited to immigration status, right? So there could also be a request for income eligibility at that time. If the applicant sends proof and is determined ineligible for Medicaid based off of immigration status, the Medicaid agency sends the applicant a denial notice, and the case is hopefully referred back to the marketplace. But we know that can be tricky sometimes in states. It varies. I'll be honest. Not every state does this perfectly. The marketplace notifies the applicant to come back to the marketplace with instructions on how to get the correct eligibility determination. The applicant returns to the marketplace. They have to indicate that they've been denied Medicaid, and they provide the needed information to establish eligibility. And then the correct eligibility determination for PTC and CSR is done. That is a very long pathway, right? Next slide, please. So this is what, these are the questions that will come up that will allow the individual to say, I've been found ineligible for Medicaid, but, I've been denied Medicaid or CHIP eligibility based off of my immigration status. These are the individuals in my family that is relevant to. And they will be able to, you'll note that it's not like this date, it starts during this open enrollment season. There's a little bit of a look back period. So that's helpful. If this happened to them last year, maybe in those cases, you would be able to go ahead and answer truthfully earlier on without having to have the person go all the way back to Medicaid and wait and then come back. So keep that in mind. But I would be really careful about doing that. Really, really, really careful, because the last thing you want is for the person to be, get the wrong eligibility determination. Next slide, please. So now let's assume that the person has income below the federal poverty line, is not otherwise looking like they're eligible for Medicaid, right? So this is an example of an adult, maybe they're a parent, maybe they're not. their parent. They're also over the income limit for the parent's eligibility in Medicaid, right, for caregivers, which is very, very low in most states. So for most adults, and they're in a state that has not expanded Medicaid. So the marketplace determines the applicant can enroll in coverage without premium tax credits, and it notifies the applicant that he or she may or they may qualify for help paying for coverage, but that proof of status is needed to make that determination. So again, this is the example that the individual is going to go, it's going to go through the plan selection. You know how everybody else, you can see the discounted price when you factor in the PTCs. That is not going to be the case for this individual. They're going to be looking at prices that are very, very high. They'll get a notice saying, you might qualify for something, but we need to verify your immigration status first. But as you can imagine, the person might be getting a little nervous when they see this cost. So again, this is why it's so helpful when you all are able to help somebody understand what's going on in the application process. If the applicant sends in proof, the case is sent to a special unit in healthcare.gov. I'm not sure how this is done in every state-based marketplace, and I'm sure it varies significantly. But in healthcare.gov, it's sent to a special unit to determine if the person is eligible under Medicaid rules based off of their immigration status. And if it's determined that the person's ineligible for Medicaid based off of their immigration status, the marketplace notifies the applicant about their eligibility for subsidies. And, if they've missed the enrollment window, which sometimes they do, right? Because people get very nervous about selecting a plan when they see really, really high ticketed prices, and they might not select it until after they've got the right determination. They would also qualify for a special enrollment period. And then the applicant returns to the marketplace and selects a plan with PTCs and CSRs, and will be granted an SEP if applicable. Next slide, please. And that is it. And we're ready for your questions. Thanks all.
Thank you, Shelby and Gabrielle. We do have a lot of good questions, so we're just going to get right into it. First question is, if proof of immigration status is needed, must someone send the original document or a copy?
Sorry, I pressed the wrong button. A copy. The copy is sufficient, and oftentimes it's preferred to upload the copy versus sending it through mail. It's going to take a lot longer through mail. So if you can upload it on the application, that would be great.
Next question. Next question is, are any Medicaid or marketplace services other than Medicaid long-term care considered to be a negative factor for public charge? Are Medicaid services provided in the home and community considered to be a negative factor for public charge?
The answer to that is no. Home and community-based services are not considered long-term care for public charge purposes. It's only residential care that is considered.
Thank you. Another question we have is, does receiving disaster assistance count negatively against public charge?
No, disaster assistance is not considered cash assistance for income maintenance. It is just a kind of assistance to help people recover from the disaster.
Great, thank you. So we have a couple more questions. What happens if I am trying to help someone apply for coverage for their family members, but they can't get through the ID proofing step to set up a healthcare.gov account?
When that is the case, I would strongly recommend calling the call center and completing the application over the telephone. And to the extent that they can, in addition to that, like I wouldn't delay it, right? And I would go ahead and complete the application over the phone, and they can do that, even if you haven't gone through the identity proofing process. But because going through identity proofing really allows you much more functionality in the long run, being able to do other things online. To the extent the person is able to and has documents that they can prove their identity, which not everybody can. So to the extent that they can, I would submit the documents to overcome that hurdle in the future, but I wouldn't delay completing the application. I would do it over the telephone. It's not ideal. Selecting a plan over the telephone isn't ideal. You can use the functionality of looking at plans online, so that can help expedite the telephonic enrollment. But again, because you don't want to delay somebody doing it, I would go ahead and submit the application over the telephone.
And one last question before we wrap up is, so on slide 23, if a person has a lawfully present status, has an income below 100% of the federal poverty level, and is in the Medicaid coverage gap, can they get APTC if they submit proof of their immigration status?
Yeah, if the immigration status has to, be processed by the unit, and then they would be able to qualify. So if an individual, even if they have income below the poverty line, if they have a lawfully present status, that makes them eligible to enroll in the marketplace, but their immigration status does not qualify them to enroll in Medicaid, then if they are able, once they prove their immigration status, whether that's done automatically through the online, verification, or whether they provide proof of the documents. Once the verification is done, then they would be able to get PTCs and CSRs, even if their income is below the poverty line.
Thank you. And we have one actually last question that Gabrielle just flagged for us to answer. So we have a consumer that has not worked for most of the year. She will only have income for October, November, and December 2023, equaling around $7,000. Her current monthly income is above the Medicaid income guideline. So technically she is not eligible for Medicaid, but she is not being found eligible for APTCs. We are in a Medicaid expanded state, so why is it need to be a coverage gap?
I'm sorry, I missed, you cut out at the end of that. So I'm
Apologies.
Just at the end.
It says we are in a Medicaid expanded state, so why is this seeming to be in a coverage gap?
Yeah, I'm confused about that as well. I think it's because of the difference between how the marketplace looks at annual income, and Medicaid looks at your current income. So there's a slight difference in that, but the individual should be able to project forward their expected income for 2024. So there's more than one question asked about income in the application. And in this case, they should have the ability to project what their 2024 income will be. And then they probably, unless, the 20, I'm trying, I always forget which year of the taxes that is looked at. It's probably going to be the case that they probably have to provide some verification of their income, but but otherwise, by projecting what they expect their 2024 income to be, the annualized income, they should be able to overcome this hurdle.
Awesome. Thanks, Shelby, for answering that very full question. We still have a little more time for our session, so I just see one more question here. Once identity and immigration status are verified, does the applicant need to go through this process again with subsequent enrollments?
It's a really good question, and the answer is it depends. So for let's put aside identity proofing to begin with. For identity proofing in whatever application that you're working with, in general, it's a once, thing. So not identity proofing, but let's think about citizenship or immigration status. Okay. So those are not, so forget about identity proofing, which is not an eligibility factor, is just a hurdle that comes up to be able to get full functionality in a government application, right? So put that aside, and what we really are talking about is verification of citizenship or immigration status that qualifies you to enroll in the marketplace, right? So if in both, you should only have to prove your citizenship once, both for Medicaid and for Marketplace and CHIP. And that should be evergreen and always done. I can assure you that that is probably not something that's going to carry with you from, let's say you apply for coverage in Virginia, or maybe Virginia is a bad example now because they're going to have a state-based marketplace. But let's say a state that uses healthcare.gov, but then you're going to apply in another state like New York that is disconnected from it. That might vary, right? But for the most part, if you're staying in the same place using the same system, you should never have to re-verify your citizenship. The same is true for a lot of immigration statuses that are not subject to change in the direction of making you ineligible. So, for example, people who have lawful permanent resident status, people who have, refugee, asylee, those kind of statuses that are not likely to change in the direction of making you ineligible. They could change in the direction of making you no longer eligible based off your immigration status, but then you would become a citizen, and then you'd be eligible under citizenship status. So for a lot of statuses, once you've overcome that hurdle, on healthcare.gov, there is what they call kind of evergreen verification. And that helps you overcome those hurdles and not present with another data matching issue again in the future. But it's not all statuses that are tagged that way, and it's not perfect, the use of the evergreen system. So I can't even say these are the statuses for sure that are never going to have this problem, and these are the statuses that will is just not that perfect, unfortunately.
Great. Thank you, Shelby and Gabrielle, for flagging and responding to those questions. Here you can see the resources presented in today's presentation, where you can find on our website and in the slide deck that was posted in the chat. You can reach out to us at the emails shown here with any of your questions, especially if they didn't get answered today, or if you have questions that come up after the webinar. As a reminder, we will be distributing the materials from today via email. Our next webinar will be Tying It All Together on Tuesday, October 24th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. You can register for this and the Spanish webinar on the Beyond the Basics website under upcoming webinars. And with that, we will bring this webinar to a close. Thank you again for joining us today.